have some breaking news, some upsetting news. The Emmy Award-winning actress Catherine O'Hara has died.
I didn't know you were going to have to stand here and listen to this.
I know, me
They
too.
should give you a chair.
I know, right?
A chair for the
I
man.
moved to the side so the sun's not on me.
Okay, smart.
Most people see Catherine O'Hara and hear a frantic Kevin echoing from 1990. But at 45, Macaulay Culkin is finally telling a different story. Beyond the slapstick and the screaming, Mac's truth about his movie mom is far more personal than a Hollywood script. It isn't just about a kid who got left behind, it's about the woman who actually stayed. From the 1990 attic to their tearful 2026 goodbye, here is the real, unscripted Mac and Catherine. The reunion and the goodbye. It was the kind of Hollywood moment that usually smells like a PR stunt. But when Macaulay Culkin stood at the podium for his Walk of Fame star in late 2023, the vibe shifted. We've all seen those cringy staged reunions where two actors who haven't spoken in decades pretend they're soulmates for the sake of a TikTok clip. This wasn't that. When Catherine O'Hara stepped up to the mic, she didn't look at the wall of cameras. She looked straight at Mac. And when Mac looked back, he wasn't a 43-year-old dad with a goatee. For a split second, he was that 9-year-old kid in the oversized white sweater again, just looking for some backup. The truth Mac has been dropping lately, especially in his raw, heartbreaking tributes following her passing in early 2026.
Breaking news this morning, really sad news here. TMZ reporting that Catherine O'Hara has died at the age of 71.
Is that Catherine was basically the only person in the industry who didn't treat him like a lottery ticket or a tragic child star statistic. She treated him like a human being. That 2023 reunion was our first real public proof that their private tether had never actually snapped. Catherine joked about neglecting him on screen, sure, but as she spoke, she reached out and brushed his hair back. It was a gesture so quiet and motherly, it basically silenced the paparazzi. She thanked him for making her look like a good mother, when the whole world spent 30 years joking that she was the worst one in cinema history. But the real weight of their bond hit us even harder this year. When the news broke in early 2026 that Catherine was gone, Mac didn't pull the usual move of having a publicist email a sterile, "I am saddened by the loss" statement to People magazine. Instead, he opened up about a side of their relationship that was never meant for the cameras. He revealed that during his roughest years, the ones where he was legally divorcing his parents and the tabloids were literally counting down to his collapse. Catherine was one of the few people on the other end of a phone line who didn't want a piece of him. She didn't want a cameo in a project, and she wasn't looking for a "where are they now?" quote. She just wanted to make sure he was okay. The truth Mac revealed at 45 is that Catherine was his North Star for how to survive the Hollywood meat grinder without turning into a cynical wreck. He described their secret meetups over the last decade as a buffer against the madness. We're not talking about flashy Oscar after-parties or posing for gram shots at Coachella. We're talking about quiet, low-key dinners where she'd sit and listen to him talk about his own kids. The irony isn't lost on him. The woman who became the global face of a bad mom for forgetting her kid on a flight to Paris was actually the person who helped him navigate the wreckage of his own family life. In these last few years, they became incredibly protective of one another. Mac recently shared a story from 2025 when he went to visit her. She was already privately dealing with the illness that would eventually take her, but she didn't want to talk about herself. She spent the whole afternoon grilled him about Brenda Song and their boys. She wanted to be 100% sure the McAllister legacy was being handled with more actual love than the movies ever showed. Mac's truth is simple. Catherine saw him as a lifelong responsibility. She carried this weird phantom guilt for the sheer chaos that Home Alone fame dumped on his tiny shoulders, and she spent 30 years trying to balance the scales with private kindness. When the world lost her a few weeks ago, the internet did what it does. It flooded with memes of Kate McAllister screaming, "Kevin!" in the middle of a crowded airport. It's a classic bit, but Mac's tribute cut through all that noise. He shared that in their very last phone call. She didn't call him Mac or Macaulay. She called him Maish. That's the truth everyone missed while they were busy laughing at the fictional neglect. These two had built a fortress of genuine care that was completely off the grid. At 45, Mac is finally at an age where he can articulate what she meant to him without the industry filter. He's telling us that this fake mother-son duo was more real than most of the biological families in the 90210 zip code. Their recent meetings weren't about chasing nostalgia or remember when stories. They were about survival. She was his link to a version of himself that existed before the world tried to tear him apart. Seeing them together in those final public moments, you could see Mac's usual armor just melt away. He's a guy who spends most of his life dodging the spotlight, but for Catherine, he stood front and center. He showed up because she never stopped showing up for him, long after the director yelled, "Cut!" and the sets were torn down. It's a heavy reality to swallow in 2026, but Mac's making sure the legacy is clear. He was never really alone. It wasn't always mom and son. Once, it was just a 9-year-old pro and a comedy vet. Two strangers in a suburban attic.
I didn't know you were going to have to stand here and listen to
I
this.
know, me
They should
too.
give you a chair.
I know, right?
It wasn't always mom and son.
Then suddenly panicked that they might miss something great. They turned around and looked back at the screen, and one of them said, "It's okay. No, it's just the mom."
Once, it was just a 9-year-old pro and a comedy vet trying to figure out if this weird Christmas script was actually going to hit. To understand the big thing Mac is spilling now at his 40s, you have to rewind to 1990, back to that massive, drafty house in Winnetka, Illinois. At the time, Macaulay wasn't a global icon. He was just a kid from a cramped New York apartment who happened to be a total natural in front of a lens. And Catherine? She was the SCTV legend, the improv queen who could turn a single line into a whole mood. When they first met in that legendary attic, they were basically two strangers tasked with faking a decade of family trauma. The industry branding for their chemistry wasn't just good casting, it was a total lightning strike. But here's the kicker. While the world thinks they were just acting out a slapstick nightmare, Mac reveals that the bond started because they were both outsiders in different ways. Catherine was the Canadian comedy genius, trying to find her footing in a mainstream Hollywood blockbuster, and Mac was the kid who was already being treated like a commodity by everyone from agents to his own family. In the middle of that suburban set, they found a weird, quiet rhythm. Mac recalls that while the other adults on set were obsessing over lighting rigs or worrying about the budget, Catherine was the one who actually checked in. She didn't talk down to him like some precious child actor. She treated him like a peer. If you watch those early scenes, specifically the ones where Kate McAllister is absolutely losing her mind, you can see the real-time feedback loop. Mac wasn't just hitting marks. He was vibing off Catherine's manic energy. He's admitted that her pro-level intensity forced him to level up. He wasn't just some cute face in a movie. He was a co-star holding his own against a heavyweight. The fact about those early days is that the famous attic scene wasn't just about punishment. It was where they actually bonded. Between takes, while the crew was resetting the cheese pizza mess, Catherine would stay in the room. She'd riff. She'd make him laugh. She realized early on that this kid was carrying the weight of the entire production on his tiny shoulders. The snappy reality of their 1990 dynamic was built on mutual respect. Mac was a one-take wonder, a term used for actors who don't mess around. And Catherine loved that. She didn't have to babysit her co-star. She just had to play the scene. But it wasn't all just great work, kid. Mac reveals that Catherine was the first person to notice the glare of fame, starting to burn him out. Even back then, she saw the way the industry was eyeing him up like a piece of meat. She'd pull him aside and keep things grounded. making sure he was still just a kid who liked video games and junk food. That's the jargon-free truth. She was his first real protector in a business designed to chew kids up and spit them out. They weren't just Kate and Kevin, they were two pros in a foxhole trying to make something that didn't feel like a total cliché. Looking back, that 1990 set was The Crucible. While the movie was becoming a cultural juggernaut, the two of them were carving out a dynamic that wasn't in the script. Mac says he learned more about being a real person from Catherine in those few months than he did from years of Hollywood handlers. She taught him that you could be the biggest star in the world and still be a decent human being who remembered the names of the craft services crew. That's the vibe he carried for 30 years. It started in a fake attic, but for Mac, that connection was the most real thing in the whole house. The world saw a woman who forgot her kid. Mac saw the only adult on set who treated him like a person. The protector in the chaos.
There are 15 people in this house. You're the only one who has to make trouble.
I'm the only one getting dumped on.
You're the only one acting up. Now, get upstairs.
The world saw a woman who forgot her kid. Mac saw the only adult on set who treated him like a person. If you look at the industry tea from the early 90s, child stars were basically treated like high-functioning props. You show up, you hit the mark, you don't cry, and you make everyone a boatload of cash.
Kevin, get upstairs right now.
Why?
Kevin, you're such a disease.
Shut up.
Kevin, upstairs.
But Mac's word about Catherine is that she refused to play that game. While the studio execs were busy counting the daily takes and his own management was looking at the next contract, Catherine was the one making sure he didn't lose his damn mind. She was the vibe architect of his childhood, the one person who realized that under the million-dollar smirk was just a little kid who was working 40-hour weeks. The real talk here is that Catherine's role as the neglectful mom was the ultimate irony. Mac reveals that between those iconic scenes of her hitchhiking with a polka band, she was actually the one keeping him tethered to the ground. He's recently opened up about how heavy the atmosphere could get when you're the most famous 10-year-old on the planet. There's a specific kind of label for it in Hollywood, the bubble. Once you're in the bubble, nobody tells you the truth anymore. Except Catherine. She was the one who would pull him aside and talk to him like a normal human being, not a global phenomenon. She'd call him out when he was being a brat and hype him up when he was feeling the pressure. Mac's 45-year-old perspective on this is pretty wild. He says that while his biological situation was becoming a tabloid dumpster fire, Catherine was providing a creative safe house. She wasn't just a co-star. She was his first real lesson in how to be a professional without becoming a total diva. She taught him how to read a room, a bit of slang that basically means knowing when to shut up and when to shine. On the Home Alone 2 set in New York, when the fans were literally screaming his name outside the trailers and the paparazzi were safari hunting for a shot of him, Catherine was the one who made sure his trailer was a no-business zone. She'd go in there and they'd just talk about normal, boring kid stuff. That was her gift to him, the permission to be boring. There's this one story Mac tells that really hits different now that she's gone. During a particularly grueling night shoot for the sequel, Mac was hit with total exhaustion. The kind where your eyes just won't stay open. The suits wanted to push through to get the shot before sunrise because time is money, right? Catherine was the one who stood up and basically told the production to back off. She saw that her screen son was redlining. She didn't care about the budget or the schedule. She cared about the kid. That's the bad mom truth. She was the most protective person in his life, during a time when protection was a rare commodity. Mac also spills on how Catherine's comedy style influenced his own survival instinct. She was the master of the pivot, taking a bad situation and turning it into something funny. He watched her handle the absolute circus of their fame with a dry, Canadian wit that he eventually adopted as his own suit of armor. When the world started coming for him in the mid-90s, he used the O'Hara method, Stay weird, stay funny, and don't let the bastards see you sweat. He's credited her with giving him the mental tools to handle the fame brain that destroys so many other child actors. She showed him that you could be a legend on screen and a total ghost in the tabloids. Looking back at this time, Mac realizes that Catherine was essentially mentoring him for a life she knew would be difficult. She saw the trajectory he was on and decided to be the one person who didn't want to ride his coattails. She gave him the real talk about the industry, the kind of insider jargon about how to spot a leech or a yes man before they got too close. She wasn't just playing a mom for the cameras. She was auditioning for a role in his real life that would last for 3 decades. While the world was obsessed with her forgetting Kevin, Mac was obsessed with the fact that she was the only one who actually remembered who Macaulay was. Then the cameras stopped, and the real world got messy. Diverging paths, the dark and the droll.
That myself?
I'm from London. I was one of 2 identical twins. Tragically, I was snatched from my crib at birth by Russian mobsters.
This is where the movie magic ends and the real life begins. After the Home Alone era peaked, the two of them went on polar opposite trajectories. In industry terms, they decoupled from the franchise. But while Catherine was entering a legendary second act, Mac was heading straight into the teeth of a Hollywood storm. This is the section where the truth gets a little gritty. Because, as Mac points out, their relationship wasn't just built on the good times, it was forged because she watched him disappear and kept the porch light on. Then the cameras stopped, and the real world got messy. For Mac, the mid-90s were a total dark out. While most kids were worrying about prom, he was legally divorcing his parents and navigating a gray list status in Hollywood. The industry term for this is cooling off, but for Mac, it felt like being ejected from a spaceship. He famously stepped away, lived a life of low-key mystery in New York and Paris, and became the subject of every "Where are they now?" tabloid hit piece. He wasn't just not working, he was actively deconstructing the brand the world had built for him. He was trying to figure out how to be Macaulay without the Culkin attached to it. Meanwhile, Catherine was busy becoming a literal deity of character acting. She leaned into the Christopher Guest mockumentary vibe, delivering absolute masterclasses in movies like Best in Show and A Mighty Wind. She was pivoting, there's that word again, into a new kind of fame. The kind that's based on being a genius, not just a box office draw. She was busy winning Emmys and building the foundation for what would eventually become the Moira Rose phenomenon on Schitt's Creek. On the surface, it looked like they had nothing in common anymore. She was the toast of the comedy world. He was the guy the paparazzi followed to see if he looked okay. But here's the insider tea Mac finally spilled. They never actually lost touch. Even when Mac was in his hermit phase, Catherine was the one sending the check-in pings. In a town where people forget you the second your last movie drops out of the top 10, she stayed plugged in. Mac reveals that she was one of the few people who didn't judge his hiatus. She didn't call him to ask when he was getting back into the game. She called to ask about his paintings, his music, and his pizza underground days. She understood that he needed to burn the house down to build something new. Mac's revelation is that Catherine's career trajectory served as his blueprint for his eventual comeback. He watched her age up with grace and a wicked sense of humor. She didn't try to stay the pretty mom from the Christmas movies. She got weirder, bolder, and more authentic. She showed him that there was a life 2.0 waiting for him if he was patient enough to wait for the right moment. He's admitted that seeing her thrive as Moira Rose gave him a weird sense of pride, like his real mom was finally getting the global flowers she deserved. This period was also when the word of silence became their primary language. Mac says they didn't need to talk every day to know they were in each other's corner. Catherine was fiercely protective of him in interviews too. Whenever a journalist would try to bait her into commenting on Mac's troubles, or his appearance, she would shut that clickbait energy down.
Well, tributes continue to pour in for Catherine O'Hara, who died after a short illness. She was 71.
With a sharp, witty remark that made the interviewer look like a total amateur. She never sold him out for a headline. She treated his privacy like it was her own. As Mac entered his late 30s and early 40s, and his life started to level out with Brenda Song and his own fatherhood, he realized that Catherine had been his silent partner in the long game. She was the person who proved that you could survive a peak at age 10 and still have a peak at age 60. She was the living proof that Hollywood didn't have to be a death sentence. At 45, looking back at their diverging paths, Mac realizes they weren't actually moving away from each other. They were just taking different routes to the same place. A version of fame that actually felt healthy. In a town built on fake smiles, how did these two stay real? Truth about Hollywood families. In a town built on fake smiles, how did these two stay real? The Hollywood family is usually a total scam, a messy mix of contractual obligations and staged photo shoots designed to sell tickets. Usually, once the production wraps and the wrap party hangovers fade, the kid actors and the adult stars never speak again. They become strangers with a shared IMDb credit, maybe trading a dry happy birthday text once a year if they share the same manager. But the story Mac is serving up at his age now is that he and Catherine cracked the code on how to build a bond that wasn't just industry real, but actually real. In industry title, they call it on-set chemistry. But what Mac and Catherine had was more like a foxhole mentality. They survived a cultural phenomenon together, and that kind of shared trauma creates a tether that's hard to cut. Mac reveals that the secret to their longevity was simple. They didn't treat their relationship like a business asset. They never leveraged each other for a guest spot or a social media shout-out. While other former child stars were busy doing reunion reality shows for a quick paycheck or trying to reboot their old hits for nostalgia bait, Mac and Catherine were having quiet lunches in places where the paparazzi wouldn't think to look. Mac spills that the real truth about Hollywood families is that they are usually built on transactional vibes. In the 90210 zip code, people hang out because it's good for the brand, or because their agents think a public dinner will spark a casting rumor. But with Catherine, there was zero ROI involved. She was a comedy legend who didn't need his child star clout to stay relevant, and he was a guy who spent years actively avoiding the spotlight. This meant their connection was pure. It was based on the fact that they actually, genuinely liked each other's company. He's admitted that in a town full of yes men and climb chasers, Catherine was his ultimate vibe check. If she liked what he was doing or thought a project was cool, he knew he was on the right track. A lot say it is authentic mentorship, but that feels way too formal for the way Mac describes it. He says she was more like the cool aunt who knew all the industry secrets and saw through all the gatekeeper nonsense, but didn't take any of it seriously. She taught him that the Hollywood family is a choice, not a requirement. You don't have to love everyone you work with. In fact, most of them are probably vampires. But when you find someone who actually gets the weirdness of your life, you hold on tight. He watched her navigate the business without losing her soul, and that became his survival guide. At 45, Mac looks at his own kids and realizes that Catherine was the one who modeled what a sane adult in the industry looks like. She didn't let the fame go to her head, and she didn't let the industry's obsession with youth make her bitter. She stayed curious, stayed funny, and stayed grounded. That's the thing about their Hollywood family. It wasn't about the bloodline or the Home Alone legacy. It was about two people who decided they were going to be the exception to the rule. They chose to be family when the world expected them to be nothing but former co-stars. In a town of fake smiles, Their bond was the only thing that didn't feel like a performance. She was his safety net, and he was the son she chose to keep. The story of a fake mom.
Then suddenly panicked that they might miss something great. They turned around and looked back at the screen, and one of them said, "It's okay. No, it's just a mom."
It turns out, you don't need DNA to be a matriarch. Now, Mac is finally pulling back the curtain on how Catherine O'Hara's influence didn't just stop when the credits rolled. It actually became the OS, operating system.
Can't let a year go by without watching and loving Home Alone together. It's because of Macaulay Culkin.
For his own life as a parent. We've all spent 30 years calling her his fake mom. But the legacy she left behind is way more real deal than anything a blood test could prove. Mac recently dropped the tea that throughout his journey into fatherhood with Brenda Song, Catherine was his secret weapon. She wasn't just sending congrats cards. She was giving him the raw dog truth about how to raise kids in the shadow of a spotlight that never truly turns off. When they write about this kind of relationship, it is legacy coaching. But for Mac, it was just Catherine being Catherine. He revealed that after the birth of his sons, he received a series of private letters from her, not emails, but actual handwritten notes that he says are the most valuable things he owns. In them, she didn't talk about showbiz or career moves. She talked about the importance of the bubble. She told him that his primary job was to make sure his boys never felt like assets for a brand. She reminded him that the reason they were so close was that she had treated him like a kid first and an actor second, and he needed to pay that forward. The reality about Catherine's legacy is that she taught Mac how to curate his life. In Hollywood, curation usually means picking the right outfits for a red carpet, but Catherine taught him to curate his peace. She showed him that you can be a legend like Moira Rose and still be a woman who goes home to a quiet life, far away from the clout chasers. Mac's words is that he's modeled his entire adult existence on her low-key/high talent ratio. He's the guy who can break the internet with one tweet, but otherwise lives a life that's totally off the radar. That's the O'Hara influence. But there's a deeper, more emotional side to this legacy that Mac shared in his 2026 tributes. He spoke about the phantom guilt Catherine carried for years. Even though she was just an actress playing a part, she always felt a weird responsibility for the Kevin McAllister explosion. She felt like she had been the face of the moment his childhood ended. Her legacy for him was the 30-year apology she didn't actually owe him, a constant stream of support, checking in during his hermit years, and being the first person to celebrate his 2.0 comeback. She was the matriarch of his chosen family, a term that gets thrown around a lot, but actually meant something in their case. He also spilled on how she helped him navigate the grief when it came to his own family's messiness. Catherine was the one who taught him that you can't choose your biological parents, but you can choose who gets a seat at your table. By being a fake mom, who acted more like a real one, she gave him the permission to walk away from toxic situations and build a life that felt safe. She was his North Star for what a healthy, funny, and supportive adult looked like when he didn't have many other examples to follow. Mac is the living legacy of a woman who was just a co-star to the rest of us. He's telling the world that the reality about Catherine isn't found in her IMDb page or her awards shelf. It's found in the way he looks at his own sons. He's teaching them the same O'Hara method: stay weird, stay kind, and never forget who you are when the cameras aren't blinking. The legacy of his fake mom is that she made him a better real dad. And as the world says goodbye to her in 2026, Mac is making sure we know that while Kate McAllister may have forgotten Kevin once, Catherine O'Hara never once forgot Macaulay. Macaulay Culkin and Catherine O'Hara proved that in a town full of scripts, The best stories are the ones you write yourselves. If you want more deep dives into the icons people loved, hit that subscribe button. We're keeping the real stories coming your way every week.